Okay, welcome everyone to the armchair this afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's meeting, in which Ed Bober is going to lead off on the potential conflict between USA and China. Because he said if China is seen as a threat by the USA, which while still by overwhelmingly the world's biggest superpower, sees China coming up along its tail and its economy growing. So the question we're asking this afternoon is there a risk of a clash between these new empires, and what is more inevitable, and what will be the results of the world's population? So I'm going to hand you over to Ed, who's leading off. How long would you like me to? How long would you like to lead off for, Ed?
Well, I don't want to talk for more than about 20 minutes, Pam. So if you could let me talk about 10 minutes and see how. Pam, when you were talking, I had a terrible echo.
Yes, somebody else had as well. I'll have to log out and log in again then.
Okay. But I hope I'm okay. I mean, can everyone else hear me?
Yes, it's all right with you. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Right. Okay.
Right. While you start, I'll just go out and come back in again. All right.
Okay. Okay.
So I'm stopping you after 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
Tell you after 10 minutes. Right.
Okay. Right.
All right. Ed.
Comrades, the United States is unquestionably the most powerful country on the planet, but it's in decline. Manufacturing employment in the United States as a share of the economy has been in steady decline since the end of the Second World War. The rate of technological innovation has been falling significantly. In 1945, the United States had over 50% of world GDP. By the 1960s, it was about 40%. By the 1980s, it was 25%, and now it's fallen to about 24%. And comrades will have followed that there's a series of big bank collapses in the USA. So the US economy is not in a good state, and over the next 12 months, it's expected to have very low growth or even negative growth. It could be heading for a recession. The rate of bankruptcy is going up. Meanwhile, China, nothing like as powerful as the USA, is on the rise. Bilateral trade between China and Brazil has grown from about 1.1 billion in the year 2000 to about 150 billion last year. China is buying Brazil's agricultural commodities and minerals and investing in Brazil's infrastructure. That's one example. China's trade with Pacific islands now exceeds that of the USA, and with this comes the incentive to develop, for those nations to develop diplomatic connections with China. And they're supposed to be, according to the USA, they're supposed to be in its sphere of influence. China has lent a total of about $1.5 trillion to more than 150 countries, spread across more than 150 countries. It's become the world's biggest creditor, lending more than the World Bank, the IMF, and the OECD put together. Over the past 20 years, China has invested more than $2 billion, and it's gradually taking over the role that the US has been playing, particularly in the Pacific. Capitalism has been expanding in China from 1949 onwards. I think most of the comrades in this room will agree that China was some kind of Stalinist state. We could argue about, precisely how we characterize it. But from 1976 onwards, the death of Mao Zedong, when Hua Guofeng took over, there's been, through a series of zigzags, there's been the introduction of some capitalism, certain amounts of capitalism, different factions of the regime arguing how far, how fast, how much, whether to continue with this allowing capitalism to grow within the Chinese economy. It's created a situation where there's sort of expectation on the part of the mass of the population that things are going to change, that there's going to be some kind of new regime in place at some point, which allows more freedom, as happened in the Eastern European states at some point towards the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s. Now, the Chinese bureaucrats who run the country don't understand that the key to healthy economic growth is workers' democracy, that creativity can be unleashed from the shop floor when workers control production. With their elite position in society, they don't see the development of productive forces from a revolutionary point of view. They only understand either bureaucratic bullying of the workers by the management or a leavening of capitalist competition. So they have this sort of within the bureaucracy, there's some desire to open up to more and more capitalism, and at the same time some anxiety about it. And the financial crash of 2008 certainly aggravated the anxiety. The bureaucracy, with some sections of the bureaucracy in any case being reluctant to let China go wholesale to a completely free market as in America. Nevertheless, China is now the world's second biggest economy, the world's largest manufacturing nation, the world's largest trading nation. It's a consumer of half the world's steel and coal, one of the biggest investors in developing nations. And there is a controlled growth of capitalism taking place in China. It's a new phenomenon globally, with special economic zones more attractive to foreign investment, no right to free trade unions, small and medium-sized businesses growing significantly. But the COVID lockdowns have hit them badly, discontent and local protests within the Chinese population. The prospect of protest is an ever-present worry for the bureaucracy. Now, the US sees China as a rival. It's often presented as a rivalry in the media. It's often presented as a rivalry of political systems, and there's some validity in that because of the still very large state sector in the Chinese economy. But it's also a rivalry for markets because of the very significant growth of capitalism within China. And so therefore the analogy with the Cold War is a bit out of date, because at the time of the Cold War in the 50s and 60s, there was very little encroachment by the Stalinist regimes on the markets that the USA and other Western powers were trading in. But what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 decades is a regime in China that's been in one way or another trying to open up trade and international transactions and collaboration, but economic collaboration with other countries in the world. I mean, for example, Xi Jinping has been very keen to develop a good trading relationship with Emmanuel Macron, and trying to get French companies to assist China in modernizing of factories and development of shipbuilding facilities. And America, Biden particularly, is trying to resist this economic encroachment of what it sees as its sphere of influence. many American companies, while Biden is doing this, many American companies, such as Apple, have achieved their growth by building up their manufacturing facilities within China, taking advantage of China's relatively cheap labor and reasonably well-educated working class compared with many other Asian countries. So we're seeing a gradual displacement of the USA, or the building up of a gradual rivalry to the USA as the world's dominant power. And with economic rivalry comes also the prospect or the possibility of military rivalry. The Ukraine war is part of a bigger international rivalry. Two rival powers are moving towards confrontation, and it's a little sort of foretaste that Ukraine versus Russia is a foretaste of the bigger confrontation of China versus the USA.
10 minutes said.
Thank you, Pam. When one superpower is in decline and threatened by the rise of the new one, war is implicit. Unless capitalism is overthrown, it's likely that humanity will move, we can't say how fast, towards a military confrontation between American capitalism and the rise of capitalist power in China. The United States is spending about $130 billion a year on research and development in armaments. China is increasing its naval activity around Taiwan and the South China Sea. And China wants unification. It wants Taiwan back in its own sphere of influence. It sees Taiwan as a breakaway province. Taiwan was, after all, where all the defeated forces of Chiang Kai-shek retreated after Mao's army won the 12-year civil war on the mainland in 1949. So, Taiwan is definitely a source of friction in this confrontation. Some Republican politicians see America's pullout from Afghanistan as a sign of weakness, which makes the Chinese invasion of Taiwan more likely. The US has got combat ships and aircraft all over the Pacific, highly trained. If China ever made the tiniest encroachment on Taiwan, there would be a massive military response from the USA. The West had to let Hong Kong go. That's a different question. There was a treaty. The West felt they couldn't get out of it. There was a treaty that it would be returned to China. And in any case, at that stage, the West hoped that the presence of Hong Kong in China would be a source of Western influence within China that would begin to erode the power of the regime in Beijing, or begin to modify it in some way, and allowing China to become a bit more open to Western influences. But the Chinese authorities have held on to their power and accommodated Hong Kong. So what if a war does develop between China and the USA, what would it be like? It would have a much greater impact on humanity than the war in Ukraine. What's happening in Ukraine is only a little foretaste. We've seen a little bit of naval rivalry between the US and Chinese Navy over who sets foot on some of the Spratly Islands. These are small islands off the coast of Japan, nearly all of them completely uninhabited and not particularly significant from a military point of view. But Taiwan is another matter. If China attempted to launch an invasion of Taiwan, there would be very few options about it sort of settling halfway. It would have to go all the way, or there's no room for compromise. It would rapidly lead to the development of US naval and air forces, and it would be very, very difficult for either side to disengage. The trading relationship between the USA and China would be massively disrupted, which would have implications for the entire world economy. I'm talking about really large-scale unemployment in countries all over the world, starvation, collapse of social welfare, because the economic connections between the USA and China are such a crucial part of world trade at the moment. There would be a disruption of global supplies, starvation, and so on. A catastrophic level of casualties as well, starting immediately with combat troops and civilians in the combat zone. It could become a major or even a nuclear conflict within a very short period of weeks or days, with casualties spreading globally because of nuclear fallout. Smaller nations would be pushed to choose sides. All major wars in the modern epoch have started with a wave of jingoism and ended up with a working class that has become revolutionary. The First World War, the Second World War, the Vietnam War. In these days of modern communication, the scope for fraternization is greater. There is a risk that such a war could become the point at which humanity begins to lose the opportunity for socialist revolution and commences an inescapable slide towards barbarism. 75 million people died in World War II. This included some 200,000 people killed directly by America's 2 nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But a nuclear war today, the scale of technology is such now that one nuclear strike could kill more people than the entire death rate of World War II. It's therefore our task to build the international movement, to prepare the mutiny, to prepare the revolution before we get to the point of World War III. I'm reminded of the song By the Doors, which was used in the terrific film Apocalypse Now. This is the end. The kind of war that impends now is really a turning point for humanity between the prospect of the working class coming to power and building socialism, or the prospect of a decline into barbarism for humanity. That's it, Pam.
Okay, thanks very much, Ed. Has my echo gone?
Yes, your echo's gone.
I've turned my mobile phone off. I'm just wondering if it's got something to do with that being sat near. Anyway, it stopped. It could be. Okay, well, that was a really good introduction. Peter, do you want to come in first?
Hi, comrades. Yeah, excellent, Ed. Thanks. As far as the United States is concerned, comparing it with China, if you think that the United States has been a capitalist-run system for almost 2 centuries, whereas in reality it's only the last couple of decades or so that's the case with China. Moreover, China has, of course, got 4 times bigger population than the United States, and yet there's clearly enough evidence to show that the USA is in decline, as I had pointed out right from the very beginning. Life expectancy in the USA is now less than that in China. The USA has lost several wars, particularly in the Middle East. and of course in dreadful time in Vietnam. In the United States, over 1 million people have died. These are figures from 2-3 weeks ago. 1.1 million have died as a result of COVID. Nobody can get the exact figures for China because of rather secrecy about it, but I bet it's not 4.5 million or anywhere near it either. Also in the United States, there are millions, uncountable, because they can't work out when it's going to stop. Millions are suffering from long COVID. Unemployment's on the rise. And as usual, when capitalism is in decline, the rich and the poor, the gap widens as it is there. And sooner or later, that will foment into serious problems for the United States government. The difference between rich and poor is growing massively and very, very quickly. It's getting worse, and the standard of life is getting worse too. Unemployment is rising. The crash that's they're heading into, by the looks of it, is going to be worse than the last one a couple of years or so ago. Inflation is now running between 8 and 10%. It's less than half that in China. It gives a distinct impression as to what's happening in both economies. But when you look at the size of the population of China, it's vast in comparison. And yet the USA is clearly in decline, and I don't think there's a way around it. Now, I heard what Ed said about wars. There's nobody so foolish to start a nuclear war, because that will be the end of all of it. And they're not going to risk that. China, you see, has been rather clever, hasn't it? It's been watching the economy and the system they have in America. It's also been watching the economy and the system they have in Russia. It's abandoned the bad bits of both those economies and mixed them up to get the best. And that's why Chinese capitalism is in growth and American capitalism is in decline and Russian capitalism is rather static. The interest rates are running high in the United States, again, more than twice the levels of those in China. And poverty is now worse in the USA than it is in China. There isn't any doubt whatsoever what's going to happen next. But as Ed finalised, let's hope sense prevails in the end, and that with a socialist system, if we can get there, can prevent the ultimate, the very last thing we all want, another world war, because it will be a wipeout. Thanks, comrades.
Okay, thanks, Peter. What's to come in next? Roger.
Oh. Well, I think that was a very good introduction and a very good contribution from Peter. I'd just like to add a few points. So far this century, that's just a period of just a little over 20 years, there have been at least 4.5 million people died in wars. And of course, we're currently seeing the most ferocious war in Europe for 80 years in Ukraine. On the part of NATO, it's a proxy war with billions of dollars worth of armaments pouring in. And from the part of Russia, a live battlefield war. They're currently meeting, the NATO powers are currently meeting to plan the next tranche of weaponry. Of all places, they're meeting in Hiroshima. And their protestations that the underlying purpose of this choice was to convey the message never again rings rather hollow, since after all, they were the ones that dropped the atom bomb there in the first place. And it looks actually far more like a threat. Look what we're prepared to do when it suits us. But of course, Ukraine is only a preliminary skirmish, one of many impending war flare-ups. I think we could say that the current situation is a bit like the 1930s, a period of savage local wars, Japan's invasion of China, Italy's of Ethiopia, the civil war in Spain. These, if you like, linked the First and Second World Wars in what could be considered an only intermittently broken new 30 Years' War, which after all didn't even end there. It was extended into the Korean War, the Greek Civil War, later the Vietnam War, to say nothing of countless smaller conflicts. Now, a temporary truce or even a shaky peace deal is conceivable, I think, in Ukraine, following the coming Ukrainian offensive, perhaps with the result that maybe Crimea and Donbass might be put under temporary United Nations control pending a referendum, and especially that would be the case in the event of a Republican presidential victory next year under either Trump or DeSantis. But this would just be a brief remission, with the conflict liable to break out again at any point. And of course, new flashpoint explosions any day, anywhere throughout the world. There are countless potential danger points now. Russia could deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, which would, of course, completely alter the whole balance of forces. China will at some point, I think inevitably, attack Taiwan, as Ed explained. Iran is quite likely to acquire nuclear weapons in the near future and could conceivably attack Israel. Israel could forestall such an attack by reciprocating in advance. And we now see, on top of all that, the first step towards significant rearmament in Germany and soon in Japan. North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Israel also have nuclear weapons. And there's risk of further proliferation, say, to South Korea and Saudi Arabia. And the weakening of US power is exposed, I think, in the Chinese brokerage recently of a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and Saudi Arabia's disengagement from the USA. And above all, there's a growing speculation over the likelihood or otherwise of what is called in academic circles the so-called Thucydides trap. And I think this elegant, obscure, classical euphemism papers over an obvious glaring certainty that where one global superpower is threatened with supersession by a rising rival, under capitalism, one or other power must eventually prevail. And as Ed has explained very clearly, China now is the world's leading manufacturer and exporter, but it's also rearming fast. According to the calculations of observers, military observers, from at most 350 nuclear warheads today, it's expected to have more than 1,500 by 2035, which would mean it would achieve parity with the USA and Russia. In other words, soon it will achieve military parity with the USA, and it has in Russia an ally which already enjoys nuclear parity. The USA, as comrades have pointed out, I think as Peter pointed out, it's actually sustained some quite embarrassing losses militarily and diplomatically. It lost the war in Iraq, in effect, in the sense that Iran is now the dominant power there. It completely lost in the most humiliating manner the Afghanistan war. Can the USA, is the question, can it afford to wait until such an unequal balance is reached with its potential enemies, with China and Russia? So I think the question is that we're living on borrowed time. If capitalism is not overthrown, then if civilized life has not already perished through climate catastrophe, an unprecedented migration crisis, etc., then I think we can say that an inevitable military bloodbath exceeding even the horrors of the 20th century lies ahead. I'm not saying that I think that nuclear war is likely in the near future, but imagine a situation where it's not even Putin in power in Russia, but say Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group. If he took over, I think he's the nearest prototype, or the nearest equivalent, rather, to a fascist and a completely thuggish and unhinged brute. If Trump or somebody even worse came to power in America, which of course is very probable, there again too, you cannot rule out the possibility, and especially of course if there's internal conflict, even verging on civil war in the USA, which is not again ruled out, that some kind of maniac could come to power, then again nuclear weapons would be their weapons of choice at a certain point. So that's why, as Ed said, why we place such emphasis on the worldwide revolts against the existing order, the explosion of uprisings that are bursting forth day after day on all the continents, and the persistent need to share ideas and experiences and build workers' unity for a civilized and harmonious world order. So I think this discussion actually is very, very relevant and has very much linked to the other meetings we've had. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks, Roger. Bob.
Thanks very much, especially to Ed for that careful and thoughtful introduction. I just want to make a few comments on the points that comrades have made. Just to hope that this will help us develop the discussion. It's clear that it weighs heavily on comrades' minds that the US is an established and extremely powerful economic entity. And it may seem as a surprise that that entity can be suddenly overcome by a Johnny-come-lately. Now, I think we have to learn from the experience of British imperialism that, and I'd like to very strongly recommend the little booklet by Lenin on imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism, because it starts exactly from the premise that having been the world leader for over 100 years, new powers have arisen. He says countries as recently as Germany, a complete non-entity economically. He's writing this in 1915. To him, Germany is a new economic power. It's only got 60 years behind it of real economic growth. He's saying that it's a characteristic of imperialism that such new powers arise, and that it's a characteristic of the system that they end up fighting wars. I mean, he says a lot more, and I strongly recommend it to comrades as a way of framing our understanding of what's going on. I think there is, on top of that, perhaps something that Lenin didn't emphasize so much, but there's a difference in character between the kinds of capitalism that came to power in Western Europe and in North America, where the bourgeoisie fought its way forward by in conflict with previous feudal classes, had to rouse the whole population in support of the new bourgeois society, and had to place political liberty at the forefront. So we, all these countries now solemnly call themselves democracies, although in their colonies they don't behave in that way at all, and not very much in their own homeland. But the point is, that's one route to capitalism. Marx did note that Germany took a different route. He called it the Prussian route, and it was the old Prussian state bureaucracy and the monarchy which mobilized the way forward to make Germany a challenger for world power. And that very redolent phrase that historians use, Germany became ready in 1914 to grasp at international power, grasp at world power. And that's what triggered World War I. And I think we have to see that the coming of Japanese capital and its approach to World War II had something very similar. It wasn't a bourgeois revolution in China that in Japan that made Japan an international imperial power. It was an old state reaching back centuries, but it mobilized capital and it mobilized Japan, and it was prepared to tackle the United States. Failed, but that's there you go. So that's the first point. I think we need to always be confirming and building up our understanding of imperialism as a system and the complexities of it. A comrade the comrade made the point about the Chinese bureaucracy being rather clever in the way it's approached things. Well, they think so themselves. There is very widespread propaganda in the workers' movement on the basis that China has cunningly found a way forward, that China's success as an economic power is due to the cleverness of the bureaucracy. And I would, especially when they compare themselves with Russia, they say those stupid Russians, they made the mistake of going for state control of industry. Whereas we're much cleverer than that. We've gone for membership of the World Bank. It's the Chinese bureaucracy, first of all, has certainly since 1949 not had any characteristic of a workers' state about it, not even a degenerated workers' state. I think Ed sort of touched on this when he said we think the Republic of China in 1949 was some sort of Stalinist bureaucracy, and in many ways it was, but it had no links with the working class. It had no. It was not based on any conception of working class organization, and it was a very militaristic thing. So they were delighted when the Americans in the late 70s and early 80s offered to open the door to China. It was a move forced on America by her own crisis and in the crisis in Western Europe. They faced a working class that was unbeaten in Britain and America, particularly France, and they wanted to circumvent that working class, and they massively relocated production abroad, and the biggest place to relocate abroad is China. They did it everywhere else as well. There's in several waves. There was first of all Southern Europe, and then it moved further afield, and now it's all over the world. There are places to which they've sent industrial production to avoid the working class, and the Chinese bureaucracy was implicated in that. They did it very willingly. So it's worth bearing that in mind. It wasn't that they were clever; they were given an offer they couldn't refuse, and I don't think they're way on top of things at all. But they are projecting they're doing everything they can to project their power. They have an influential voice in the British trade union movement, and amongst they present themselves as a spokesperson for the global South. And I think it's important that we understand that China is an imperialist power, because they're not going to bring peace and brotherhood to the global South. They're bringing capital, and exploitative capital that will be destructive. But we have to warn people about this, and it adds both importance and complexity to what Ed has said about, and others have said about, the need to reconstruct revolutionary leadership. Yes, we must, but we must also do as much as we possibly can to understand the situation that we're in. Thanks a lot, comrades. I hope I didn't.
Thanks very much, Bob. Kieran.
Okay. Hopefully the cameras can see me okay. Take my hand down. So first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's good to be here. I met with Roger yesterday with some other comrades from the internationalist standpoint, and he kindly provided an invitation to attend this meeting, so I was only too happy to come along. I'm busy, I'm traveling, so I'm in a car and I haven't been able to take proper notes, so I just want to make a very short contribution. So it's a very good lead off, very good contributions from comrades, throwing up all sorts of issues. The class character of China from 1949 onwards and how it has evolved, I think, is something that is of great interest and that I think we all wrestle with and be good to return to at some point. But I just want to make some points about perspectives with short, medium, and long term. And I think it is important that we retain a sense of balance about our perspectives for conflict between China and the United States. Because I think one of the impacts of the war between, or the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the sense that conflict can happen unexpectedly in places where it just doesn't seem possible, and we can be taken unawares. I think that's left its mark on the left in a slightly unhelpful way. Now, I agree what happened in Ukraine was not easy to predict. I mean, I didn't predict it. I didn't expect it. I thought until the 11th hour that the Russian maneuvers were just that, were maneuvers. It was saber rattling, they wouldn't invade. But we do know that Russia previously moved into Georgia, previously moved into Ukraine, moved into the Donbass. So perhaps we shouldn't have been so surprised. And we also shouldn't have been surprised by the unstable nature of the Putin regime, that perhaps meant that at some point he would miscalculate. And he has made a major miscalculation. But that doesn't mean that the Chinese regime will make a major miscalculation, nor that the United States regime will make a major miscalculation, even with Trump as president, because of all of the tentacles of power from the apparatus behind Trump, behind any president. It would take a president particularly out of control, and I don't think Trump was as out of control as he appeared at times in terms of foreign policy, for there to be a sudden, unexpected move. So I think we need to be careful within the ranks of Marxism, small as they are, and the layers that are influenced by Marxism, in particular with young people, just to counsel that whilst there may be sharp military conflict between the United States and China in the short to medium term, it is less likely. It's less likely, in my opinion. And Roger made an interesting point about the current period, or the period moving into, being not unlike the period between the two world wars of conflict, the Spanish Civil War, the different conflicts that arose in that period. But I before Roger made that point, I was already thinking it through in my head, and I think perhaps the better analogy would be the Cold War, the long Cold War, which went on for decades, where the Soviet bloc and the United States-led bloc were in confrontation throughout. It's an economic confrontation, a diplomatic confrontation, exercised through soft power in many cases, but also a series of proxy wars, dozens of proxy wars, but never all-out conflict. And I think it's more likely that the Chinese-United States confrontation will continue to develop in that way for some years to come, and perhaps for a long, 15, 20, 25 years before it would ever come to all-out conflict. Comrades, we all understand the way China is penetrating the economies of the global south. And I had some experience of this directly just before the COVID pandemic, when I had reasons to be in Cambodia. And I was in Cambodia not as a tourist, but for work. And I think if you're in any country for work, you do tend to get onto the surface a little bit more about what's happening. You talk to people, they talk to you differently because you're there for a longer period of time. And the penetration of Chinese capital into Cambodia was quite remarkable. I'd never been there before, I haven't been to Phnom Penh, but on the first day you looked around and just the high-rise buildings everywhere, high-rise office accommodation, high-rise living accommodation, most of it empty. And my first awareness of it came from the taxi driver on the way in from the airport. He said the Chinese have come. He didn't like the Chinese. There's ancient enmity. He said not only do they bring capital, the finance, but they bring their own building materials. They import all their own cement. They import all of their own workers. So the workers on the building sites are all Chinese. And then he said then in a complete dismissive way, even bring their own prostitutes. Everything's imported into the country. Cambodian people don't like it, but it's happening. It's happening everywhere in the global south. And that's where Chinese power is now exercised. So China has no interest or need to move towards a military confrontation. Somebody made the point already, one of the comrades, that America might make a call at a certain point that it needs to move before it's too late. But I think they're going to be very careful about it. They are, at the moment, increasing their hegemony in Europe, the Western European theatre. NATO is enlarged into Eastern Europe. So the American ruling class has a certain confidence in, despite its weaknesses, because of its absolute control, if you like, of certain theatres. So I think we're more likely to see a long period of confrontation with risk of conflict, risk of all-out conflict, but not likelihood of all-out conflict. I think that has to be our awareness, our perspective, because I think that makes it easier for us to orientate towards young people in particular. You might have a sense of impending doom, just as they do around the climate catastrophe. They might have a sense that war is inevitable, and then that can bring a fatalism, which is not always helpful if you want to win new cater to Marxism, and I don't think it's accurate. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks very much, Kieran. Matthew, next. We just say there's a number of hands up if comrades could try and keep comments to near to 5 minutes as possible.
Okay.
And then hang on, and then we can come back later on. Okay, Matthew.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. It's been interesting. I think there's a series of theoretical questions been thrown out with this one. I think what the previous comrade just said is in many ways wrong, because it's quite clear. The two big things are, of course, it's quite clear. If you look at Ukraine, that the US has spent considerable effort. With a coup in 2014, Victoria Nuland of the State Department said they spent $5 billion on subverting the government of Ukraine. Ukraine's clearly been used, and therefore it was directed in that way. And it points, the geographical point of Ukraine is it points to the heart of Russia. That's why they do it. So obviously, it's not. I don't think it shouldn't be a surprise that there is a war at all. The same applies actually to China. The American military has actually said, if you see the latest American pronouncements, they are planning for war. They're not planning for like talking and jumping up and down and Cold War. They're planning for war. That's what they want. The guy who's now the head of US, the general now in charge of the US logistics, has said we are going to have a war by 2025. He said it. So get ready. We're going to have a war. So that's the intent of the American military. They are planning for war, and not in the long term, in a relatively short space of time. I think the other thing is raised. I mean, Bob essentially implies that China's always been capitalist. I mean, China's a deformed worker state. What we have, I mean, it clearly isn't entirely capitalist even at this point. I mean, it was taken over by the Stalinist bureaucracy and run as a Stalinist pattern country. There's no question of that. I think that the thing is, I mean, there are various there are key features I think we should draw out in these terms. One, obviously, that the state and the bureaucracy still has huge degree of control. Capitalism there is capitalism, but it's not unfettered, and it's not in control. The state machine is not even able to operate, without outside of quite close control by the state machine. So it's a strange kind of hybrid. Neither one nor the other. But interestingly enough, the point is also that in fact in 2008. Because of that, China actually was able to revive the world economy. The Chinese actually went for this mass period of growth, particularly focused on property, and poured more concrete than had ever been seen in human history, literally, and actually held up the rest of the world capitalist economy in many ways. It was a huge issue in those terms that the capitalism actually survived, because in some substantial part to the actions of the Stalinist bureaucracy in China, not the least of the Stalinist crimes. I think what that also breeds at the moment, of course, the other thing we should all watch, of course, is instability, financial instability within China itself. The fact they've actually built this enormous property sector, which accounts for now, I think, we're getting on for a quarter of the economy. Much of it is in a state of absolute collapse. You know, they've got huge numbers of these empty tower blocks and so forth, and all these development, massive development companies, all of which have borrowed money all over the place. In many cases, they've borrowed that money from outside. They've borrowed in dollars and all this sort of stuff. And these things are on the point of collapse, which are, it's a huge question, not just for China, but for the capital, again, for the capitalist economy in the world scale. You know, it's enormous. I mean, and China, as comrades have said, I mean, the point is that China has been the world's largest exporter of manufactured goods since 2010. You know, it's not a minor question. We can say, okay, that the US is still the dominant economy, but in significant questions, it is China that is driving, substantial parts of the world economy, and therefore bears substantial bears watching on that basis. The other question, I think, which is raised by this, and which comrades have raised in other calls and so on and so forth, is the nature of imperialism, and how much does China and the behaviour of China fit the description of an imperialist power. Now, I mean, from my point of view, other people have contended that Russia is an imperialist power. I can't see it, because I can't see that Russia actually exports capital and then sucks into itself the results of that capital. What it does, as basically a kleptocratic bunch of oligarchs, is actually suck money out of the country. That's what they do. They export money to the safe havens of the major capitalist countries. It's different in Chinese terms. It's quite different, as people have said. They do. They behave in Africa as an imperialist power, almost classically so. But at the same time, we have to say, well, it's not actually, cannot actually be characterized completely as a capitalist country. It doesn't behave as a capitalist country. But so in those terms, it's a question then of looking at, what is the nature of this thing, and actually trying to tease this out, because obviously we're in a position where we can't just, use Lenin. And I mean, in those terms, interesting enough, actually, Lenin made major errors because he obviously mostly relied on looking at Germany rather than Britain, in those terms. But however, if we look at Lenin's model, in order to understand China, we'd have to go beyond it and start to look at other things. However, in those terms, we can say there are these features of imperialism in China. But I think that the final point I would make is that we're not in the position now of saying, oh well, there's going to be some kind of a prolonged, bit of swearing and odd wars around the edges bits, and proxy wars and all this. The Americans are planning a major war against China, and they intend to suck all of their assorted lackeys, including particularly obviously the British, and most of the other Europeans, if they possibly can, into this conflict. And our real task is to say, how is it possible to stop that process? Because that's what they want to do. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Matthew. David?
Well, comrades, it's a very rich discussion, and many important facts are brought to bear. And I think we've also had a number of varying interpretations, which really makes this a rich discussion. I want to deal with the question of the prospects for war arising out of unbalanced relationships, which are maybe known or not known. And then suddenly there's a fracturing of power relations internationally and an explosion of war, as we've seen in Ukraine. And that is a major test of each power, each nation state and each power, with the possibility of miscalculation, sharp turns, sudden changes, and open warfare, unplanned and unprecedented, taking place, because that's what we do see. War clarifies the balance of power and really exposes the real basis of power and armaments and morale in each major state. Now, the balance of opinion among US experts and dealing with the US-China relationship was that Trump unbalanced the relationship, which was going relatively smoothly up to the time of his coming to power. And that is Trump certainly is a blatant racist. Every time he uses the word China like that, you know what he's implying. There were race riots against Chinese and Asian people during COVID, and that's no accident. We're dealing with a regime in America which is, as Matthews pointed out, preparing for war, but it's an uneven preparation because a number of the bourgeois actually think it's not actually a good idea. There's a vacillation, on the question, as there must be, because actually preparing for war and actually having war, it will be a disaster for US imperialism, a disaster for the EU, a disaster for all mankind. It's not just a war which can be confined, which, as you see in Ukraine, the waves of influence or the waves of impact, spread like a massive stone being thrown in a pond. Now, just what is this unbalanced relationship? Basically, it is around the development of trading relationships, the development of productivity, and the development of science and technology in science in China and in the States. We do have to know that the development of China, particularly manufacturing, which we've mentioned, is largely the impact of foreign investment in China. The Chinese, when Nixon went to China and to open up China, was the way he saw it, to capitalist influence in 1972, he encouraged US investment in China as a basis of spreading capitalism in China and actually providing the investment to modernize China, because actually China was in pretty bad shape. After the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, and so forth, China has nothing like the strength that we now see in its economy, and it had major political problems as well of stability. Now, what has happened is that investment, plus the developments of science and technology in China itself, which was a spin-off but also autonomous, has led to the development of manufacturing. But it is all absolutely based on massive trading relationships. Unlike Russia, China is fully engaged in the world economy and in fact is the greatest trading nation in the world. Now, that is an unprecedented development for a state which feels that it is planning an economy. In fact, what it's saying is that it's impossible to have a planned economy, even in a massive state like in China, if you are engaged in such trading relationships, because every change in trading relationships means a change in the planning apparatus. And as we've seen in the recent period, with the crisis internationally, first of all, it meant that China could give a impetus to growth, and maybe it will again, but also it means it's vulnerable to crises. If there's a crash on the US stock exchange, there's also a crash in the stock exchange in China, in Hong Kong and elsewhere, and a vulnerability of the property sector to capitalism in capitalist relationships is there. Now, I want to raise a point which hasn't been raised yet, and at least the way I'd like to see it, and that is that China is a totalitarian state. Every single movement of each individual in China is monitored. The relationships that you have, the criminal cases have shown this, that every single movement of an individual in China is partly monitored. On top of this, the bureaucracy has to pass tests. There's a Peking test of conformity, which is conducted on all people prior to a promotion or anything of that kind. In other words, it's a state which has some ramshackle set of ethno-nationalist ideas. It's a rampant nationalist ideology, but it's all built around the great thoughts and absolute conformity. Now, that is vulnerable to democratic movements. We will see movements in China developing on a class basis, but also on a basis of the desire of all humanity to be able to have free discussion, free thoughts, and so forth. So it has that, that possibility, but it does mean that for a period, the bureaucracy is up in the sky. It may make decisions which, like Putin, were absolutely arbitrary. I think the invasion of Ukraine was purely a Putin's decision. I don't think he shared that decision with anybody else until he'd made it and he passed the orders downward. We could see the same development in China, which is possibly not quite to the same extent, but in which the bureaucracy is hemmed in different ways. There is no way in which the elite in China is actually really open to to public pressure of various kinds. And I don't want to go on about it. I'd like to have said more about it. Now, I just want to deal finally with the question of the possibility of war and war psychosis. I think it's a major challenge to the left and a real danger on the left that either we end up in defense of our own regime, of our own capitalist system, which I think Bob pointed to one way or the other, there are different formations of capitalism internationally, or alternatively, we want to see a development of left defeatism. In other words, it's our regime we should concentrate on and try and accelerate the defeat of our own nation, which is basically the position on much of the left in the state, which totally alienates it, obviously, from most working people, because nobody wants to see their own country go into crisis. Both of these have real dangers, to us. And a victory, let's say, or a movement in the direction of Putin's having victory in Ukraine will certainly accelerate the Chinese bureaucracy in thinking we could take this route. We're dealing with a Bonapartist regime, which is partly influenced by external fact, but also has its own momentum in terms of the development of its international policies. A point I have to make in relation to
you just
imperialism.
Stop winding up, comrades. You've had quite a while.
Okay, just remember this. China has the most massive accumulation of foreign exchange of any nation in the world. This is the primary basis on which imperialism is to be constituted. And what is imperialism? It's domination over other countries and profiting from those countries, to put it very crudely. At the moment, the danger is that China actually has no domination, at least not a domination that they want over the region. The Philippines is making an independent position. Japan is opposed. South Korea is opposed. So although it has this massive surplus, it has to search internationally for points of investment, and that increases the possibility of tensions, political and military. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. But we'll have Hewitt next, and I'll just ask, after that, I'll give Ed the option of making some comments mid-discussion if he wants to.
I'll be very short. It's actually, I think, a contribution to Bob and David's contributions, if they would accept the contribution. I think I'm concerned about the systematic approach to studying, to understanding the Western and Chinese imperialism. And I think a proper systematic approach would be to go back to Reagan and before him Nixon. The relations that they engendered with China in buying up its working class. I think social economic relations were engendered by that relation that came into being. And we have to understand how it developed until present to be able to understand such speculation as a possible war and so on. I cannot speculate on the possibility of war. It would be extremely stupid for any ruling class to embark on a nuclear war, because it will be mutually destructive with consequences far beyond their control. Nevertheless, we also need to understand Chinese imperialism. As far as I understand Lenin and about imperialism, is the export of capital. But it's not just a simplistic export of capital, it is a penetration of the exploited countries, and it penetrates its social economic fabric. It becomes part of it. Places like Namibia and South Africa has a financial system and productive system integrated with imperialist countries like Britain and America. Chinese export of capital, to my mind, does not take that form. It has an inherent fetter to be able to penetrate any country. It would probably be easy for it to penetrate Eastern countries with similar systems, social economic systems with bureaucratic control and so on. And but it will definitely find great difficulty to penetrate countries where there is some form of democracy, or where there is no or little bureaucratic control. What I have seen is that the investments that they make is not permanent investments, in that they erect factories or something like that in which they exploit the colonial countries for decades to come. Once they have done the exploitation in any concern that they have created in the exploited country, they pack up everything and they leave. So there's an inherent problem that it faces. It's bureaucratic control of its productive processes, and its the capital that it exports puts it in a serious dilemma in these exploited countries. And these are the issues that I think we need to understand fully, to understand the relation, the true relation between Western and Eastern imperialism. The Chinese regime is a bureaucratic regime. It has certain definite forms of backwardness. It is in direct clash with its working class. The COVID crisis showed it. These are aspects that need to be studied and analyzed. The interpenetration of Eastern and Western capital also needs to unravel fully to understand the conflicts that can arise out of that. That's all. Thank you.
That's great, comrades. Thank you very much. There's no other hands up at the moment. Ed, do you want to come back and comment on some of the points that have been made?
Yeah, I do, Pam, but to be honest, I'm overwhelmed by the richness of what's been said, and you know, I mean, there's just so much. I mean, a lot of very good contributions, and nothing, you know, nothing that I especially want to sort of take up or disagree with. I do agree. I think it was Peter who mentioned this in the first contribution, that you know, another crash in the financial system is coming, and it's going to be a bigger financial crash than what we've seen recently, certainly, and you know, with huge implications for the world economy as a whole. Was it Roger who was talking about the role of the Wagner Group in Russia, and Trump in the USA, and that we can't? I mean, I agree that we can't rule out the possibility of nuclear war. Of course, you know, capitalists know that a nuclear war is not in their interests. But one of the outstanding features of capitalism, which is, you know, it's first explained by Marx himself, and then gone into in more detail by Lenin, is that even though capitalists know certain steps are not in their interests, because of the relationships of competition, rivalry, and so on, capitalists nevertheless sometimes take steps that are not in their interests. And you know, I think we have to be alive to the possibility that you know, there are capitalist regimes in this world who are capable of taking humanity into a nuclear war. I agree with Kieran that when the war in the Ukraine was impending, I too thought that Russian maneuvers were just for show. I was taken by surprise by the fact that it went to war, and you know, it's a lesson to us all that we have to be, you know, alert. We have to be alert to, you know, sudden changes and blow-ups that make you know, capitalists get themselves into a position where they are posturizing for show to sort of demonstrate their powers and so on, but then they get themselves further and further into that position until war is kind of unavoidable. Now, I mean, I think Matthew raised some very interesting points, including this question of, does China fit the description of an imperialist power? And I mean, imperialism has moved on from the kind of politics that were described by Lenin in his great book on imperialism. You know, China, since, you know, certainly since about the mid 1970s, China is has not demonstrated all the features of a Stalinist state in the pure sense that we understood from, you know, from Trotsky's writings about Russia under Stalin in Revolution Betrayed. China it's a new form of economic relationship in which a Stalinist system has systematically, in a controlled way, allowed a very significant growth of capitalism, and that it's very different from the kind of catastrophic collapse of Stalinism in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s. It's far more if you like, intelligently led, still by a bureaucracy, and by a bureaucracy who don't understand that the future of humanity must lie in workers' democracy, but nevertheless who've tried to steer away from some of the most crudest blunders of the Stalinists who were running Eastern Europe in the 1980s. The Americans are planning a major war against China. Matthew's question was, how is it possible to stop that process? And I think there's no other answer to that question apart from preparing the international solidarity of the working class in order to develop workers' resistance to capitalist war. And ultimately the revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist system. Thanks, Pam, for letting me in. I hope that stimulated a little bit more of thought, and I'll leave it for that for the moment.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Well, there's no hands up at the moment. Does anybody want to come in, or does anybody want to come in again who's already spoken? Bob Archer.
Just to explain something, thanks, comrades, a quick one. In 1950, my parents were part of a small Trotskyist group, which arose from the wreckage of the quite big revolutionary communist party that grew during the Second World War in Britain. That group blew apart because many comrades, my aunt and uncle, for example, who then went off to set up the Socialist Workers' Party, or the beginnings of it, thought that Russia was a capitalist country and that China was a capitalist country. And the movement split. Tiny as it was, it split. My parents went to the wall to say that they recognized China was a gain of the revolution. It was over the Korean War. The state caps, as we call the Shaftmanites in Britain, said it was a war between two capitalist countries. We didn't think so. I mean, I was 4 years old. I wasn't involved in the discussions, but the core of the Trotskyist movement in Britain stuck with, and rightly, I think, they said that China was a gain of the revolution. Trotsky had talked about revolutions arising out of the Second World War. China was definitely one of those, and so was Yugoslavia in its best. But we're faced, that was 70 years ago, you know. I'm not arguing that China is an imperialist, a sort of state capitalist country. I think they took a definite turn when, as Yevert said, when they welcomed in US money, and comrades have pointed that out. But above all, they showed themselves ready to engage in what's been politely described as China labor arbitrage. That is, for something like 40 years, to a greater or lesser extent, the labor of Chinese workers has been embodied in commodities that were sold so cheaply in the West that it both helped to undermine Western industry, and it kept people from actually revolting, from actually taking any revolutionary road in the West, because we had this flood of cheap. I remember the one that struck me the most. I had to get a car part. I had an automobile, a wrecked old automobile. I had to get a new headlamp shape, headlamp array to put in it. It cost coppers. And I asked the guy at the shop, where was it made? This is in about 20 years ago. And the guy said, oh, it's made in China. Of course it bloody was. That's China labor arbitrage in reality. And the bureaucracy engaged fully in that. And in the process, I mean, if you read some of the stuff, I read with interest the book that Pluto just published by somebody that studied in detail all the development of the relationship between the working class and the state in China. And in his view, the lower ranks of the bureaucracy are up to their necks in every part of industry. It's difficult to tell them apart. So anyway, just some points for discussion. I think comrades have started a really, really good discussion, and I felt moved to add another stone to the wall.
Thank you very much, Bob. John or Dominic?
Yeah, it's Dominic. It's just a few thoughts and maybe a bit confused thoughts, but I think that when Kieran was talking about a comparison with the Cold War and the sort of Cold War happening today, I think we've got to look at the circumstances under which the Cold War existed. And I think the first thing you've got to look at is that the West was in a post-war boom during most of the Cold War. It started to hot up when that boom sort of didn't sustain itself. And the other thing was, as far as I see it, the Soviet Union had no plans whatsoever of expansion. In fact, it was quite the reverse. In the early 20s, the Soviet Union sabotaged the British general strike, sabotaged the risings that were taking place in China in the same year. And ever since, the only thing they've been involved in, of a significant thing, was Cuba, where they planted missiles there because the Americans had got missiles in Turkey. And when the Americans agreed to withdraw their missiles from Turkey, Russia or the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles from Cuba. So I think you've got to look at what's going on today, because my history is not brilliant, but from what I understand of the beginnings of the beginnings of the First World War, as far as Germany was concerned, it was hemmed in economically by the British Empire. And it wasn't a question of wanting a war. As far as they saw it, they were being so hemmed in, they had no alternative but to try and burst out and do something about it. And it was similar with Japan in the Second World War, as I understand it. The Americans were putting sanctions on Japan with oil and all this sort of stuff, and preventing the development of the Japanese economy by that, and Japan again burst out. Now, the thing that is going on now is, well, I turn to China. I mean, looking at the situation today, you'd be hard stretched to say, when was China a socialist country? Under the present, under Mao and his successors. Because the Chinese Communist Party came to power, as I understand it, on the back of a peasant army. The workers were told not to participate. Where was the involvement of the working class in anything like Soviets, of any sort of labor, working class democracy taking place, having any sort of impact on the regime that was there? And without that sort of relationship, you've not got socialism. I think that's something I would draw to the comrades' idea. And the frightening thing to me is this thing that the capitalists are rational. I think when you had the British Empire, they planned, I think as Ted Grant used to say, they planned for almost centuries, certainly decades. The capitalists now don't seem to plan anything. You've only got to look at one example, and that's global warming. Global warming is predicted to increase by 1.5% in the next 5 years. Now, maybe my memory's going, but I thought that wasn't supposed to happen for 50 years because of the steps that the capitalists were going to do to prevent it. it's totally rational for the capitalists to want to stop global warming, as far as I can see, but they're not doing it. And the reason they're not doing it is because they don't plan, they're not organised, they're looking at their own interests, and they're pursuing their own interests, and that means not getting involved in cutting coal and oil and all the rest of it. So those are a few thoughts I've got. I'll leave it at that. There was something else I was going to say, but forgotten. Old age is creeping on.
Thanks, Dominic. If it comes back, put your hand up again. David.
Cromwell, I just wanted to add a few points in relation to, what can I say, constraining factors on the United States and to some extent on China. If you go in America to any college, you'll see Chinese students there. And they're not a few, they're lots. In the past, there have been 360,000 Chinese students on American campuses, at state colleges, private colleges, Harvard, everywhere. And now it's declined to 280 or so 1,000 students. Those students, I've asked my friends who are students, are mainly studying business studies. They don't study politics. Some are involved in science and IT and the like. But they are a generation which China has used. Many of those graduates have taken over in the past, have taken over the nuclear power stations, have done the advanced planning in science and technology in China and so forth. All that was intended by America to turn the Chinese bureaucracy into a pro-American position. But it's not over. And in fact, just down the road, Xi has his daughter, I think, in Harvard, just a few miles away from here. So they are. It's quite extraordinary, the fact that there are sort of embedded relations of that kind. The other embedded relation is of US investment in China, which is, again, quite extraordinary. As I've mentioned, the figures on trade partly represent the unbalanced trade deficit or trading relation between China and America are partly false, because a lot of that trade is actually trade from US companies sending components back to America. For instance, all our cell phones, all our iPhones are still made in China. In other words, China is exporting iPhones, but actually they're Apple iPhones. So, they don't want to pull out. They're experimenting with investing in India and elsewhere. But those companies, including Kentucky Fried, sells more chickens in China than it does in the States. Now, capitalism, I mean, some are saying, well, look, it's inevitable and the war is on and it's all being planned. But actually, there are other plans also going on within a capitalist state, which isn't a planned position. Let me say, not the state, but the corporate bodies, involved in competition with each other, and are also trying to expand into China. So there is sort of a lot of. I just wanted to develop that side of it. And if I could mention, and state relations, until recently, there've been very good relations between China and America on drug policy. Now, the figures have been mentioned about the decline in US life expectancy, and the main reason is through youth taking drugs. 100,000 youth die of drug overdoses in America, and it's rising. And in the past, China and America have worked together, and they've successfully, reduced the import of fentanyl from China. Now the fentanyl is being manufactured in Mexico and imported into America. And China apparently still now is prepared to cooperate with America, on that basis. It's a real security concern for America. I mean, I just know right in the local place where I am that some of the kids on this, and it's deadly. It'll kill you. Something that you can hardly see will definitely kill you. So that is a security state. The other limiting factor, if I could mention it on China at the moment, is that the Belt and Road Initiative has expended billions. I think Ed gave the exact figure. But actually, most of that is now in some state of chaos. Just as the World Bank had developed massive dams and all kinds of infrastructure, and then found that it couldn't get repaid, and therefore you had to have austerity programs. All the rest. China's going through the same experience. It's developed docks in Sri Lanka, they're not being paid back. It's developed enormous infrastructure in Africa, that's not being paid back. Everywhere it says made these major investments, it's now having to use emergency aid, the same as the IMF. It depends on the IMF to carry out austerity programs for itself to be able to be paid back. If you have massive surplus, you want to spread it around, you want to gain power, if just put it crudely politically, but you don't want to have massive losses. And China's now in the same situation as in America in terms of the world crisis, and finding that its loans are not being repaid, and it's insisting on capitalist terms in terms of that, and its interest rates are slightly below the West, but actually they're still there at 7% or so. So, you know, those are limiting factors. I'm mentioning these as constraints towards an unbridled level of competition, rivalry, and warfare.
Thanks very much, David. I'm going to take Jimmy next because you haven't spoken yet.
I'm going to do a contribution that's going to be very personal. I happen to be very fortunate to be the grandparent of a young Chinaman. He's only 12 months old. He's got Irish and Chinese nationalities. Now, the life that little child has been born into is an eye-opener to me and to the rest of the family. Very often we had the image of China as a place with low quality, overcrowded housing, badly paid jobs, and a generation just one remove from the peasantry. And we understand the great industrial developments that were made, the great resources that were spent on the military, and so providing a core of well-paid or reasonably comfortable workers. I had the pleasure of visiting China a couple of years ago, and I was staggered, absolutely staggered, because alongside old China, the tourist China, the Great Wall and that, all of which are magnificent achievements of humanity, never mind China. There's also an opportunity to get into the homes of ordinary workers. And in this, not so much in the big cities, but in the smaller cities and the bigger towns, with people living in 2, 3, 4 story accommodation, 2, 3 rooms, sanitation fairly basic, rooms not all that big, street markets more the source of food than the major shops, and the shops themselves with a stunning solution to heating. You just simply open the front of the building and you have a coal put on your overcoat. But the thing about it was that this was a generation of people who had grown up, the people of my generation and slightly younger. Now, I was there for one of my kids marrying one of their kids and looking at the way the life that they were going into. They didn't go into the smaller quality housing. They went into apartments which in Dublin would be considered to be what we would call the D4, good quality apartments, big space, clean, well-developed, good access in modern cities. This young couple settled down in Wuhan. Up to COVID, very few people knew Wuhan existed. Now most of the world knows it exists. But Wuhan has a great historic contribution to the Chinese Revolution. Mao himself had part of his life, part of his political activity built around his life in and around Wuhan. But modern Wuhan, up to a few years ago, was only a small town as well. It's now an absolutely massive, massive town. They have fully occupied international airport with 1 and possibly 2 on the way. They have a plan for infrastructure of expanding 2, 3, and possibly up to 6 times the area of the city. The new motorways are already in the process of a series of expanding circles of motorways, and it'll be possible to have a couple of million people on the move every day without traffic jams, which is an incredible thought. We're privileged every morning and every evening, big thanks to modern technology, and this little kid is brought on to the computer. He's brought on because the son wants him to go to bed and rise in the morning with listening to an English voice, because he wants them to learn English as well as Chinese. And sometimes they go for a walk, a simple thing, go for a walk before bedtime. And it gives you a chance to have a look at a city. It's a modern city. It's got quality everywhere. It's got real degree of comfort. It's the type of place you'd like to live in, maybe settle down in. But when you look out the apartment window, and at the moment they're in a place on the 5th floor, and you look out at sunset across the city, you're not looking out at small old buildings like where the parents come from. You're looking at skyscrapers. You're looking at buildings that have a quality, a balance, and they have an air of a plan about them. These are full of young people of modern China. Another point that's important is they're planning to leave this apartment and go into their own house of their own. The house of their own is going to be built. It's in progress at the moment. It'll be built over. I think it's a 4-year plan based on phased contributions. But it's been built by private contractor, by private labour. It's not been built by the. It's working to a state plan, but the work has been done by the contractor. So their relationship is purely a commercial relationship with the contractor. But the difference is when my children here in Ireland buy houses, they buy themselves into 25 to 35-year mortgages. This young guy is going to have an 8-year mortgage. That is going to completely transform his life. He's going to have, little lad is going to have an opportunity from next year on. He'll have the opportunity for more or less free education right through to third level. That's a tremendous perspective for somebody to have for their kid. And it's totally understandable. My lad doesn't want to come home because he's lived in misery and poverty in this country. But the thing about it is, it raises a question. For years, we had a perspective, and a couple of leading political theorists had the idea that China could not avoid another revolution, a revolution against the bureaucracy, that it would be an automatic take, that they would create the workers in the factories and the workers in the towns, and that the workers with the new education and the collective activity would automatically, and that was the key word, would automatically develop revolutionary ideas and move to revolution to overthrow the Stalinists and overthrow the state. I doubt that word automatic is an accurate word in that perspective, because I see nothing automatic, and I'm not being dismal in any way about it, nor am I saying it's inevitable. It's going to stay that way. China is going to be in a state of permanent expansion, permanent development. That's nonsense. But the thing about it is, there is nothing automatic about the fact, because the grandparents that I met are reasonably content. They had limited ambition. They started poor. Their ambitions weren't great. They're now coming to a stage where they're going to move into pension age and pension society. They feel secure. Their medicine is secure. The money they get in is going to make them feel happy. Their children have greater ambitions, but they are also of the attitude that those ambitions can be realized, that their life is going to be more secure than their parents, and they look forward to greater even greater life and comfort and expansion for their kids. With that in mind, it raises the question of how we see work in China. I don't think there's anything automatic that the revolution, people are going to wake up on a Monday morning and decide this is a good day for revolution, we're going to overthrow that state. Because the consciousness of the people at this stage, throughout the generation, is such that their experiences will have to change. Their experiences will have to challenge the comfort and the expectations that they have. And that's something that only at that stage, apart from the odd individual who approaches it from an academic point of view, from an experiential point of view, a lot of people have an opportunity to go possibly through their whole lives without feeling the necessity to raise political, socialist and revolutionary ideas and challenges. I just leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Jimmy. Right, we've only got one hand up now, which is Matthew. So after Matthew, I propose we return to Ed and give Ed the chance to sum the discussion up.
Okay,
Matthew.
Thanks, comrades. I think the thing is that it's interesting what Jimmy's saying, but the problem they've got, of course, is that the companies who are building those apartments are going bust. You get in a position in which people are saying, okay, we paid or we whatever for this apartment, and the companies just collapse. And people turn around and say, well, okay, and the state actually is enforcing against those people when they try and get the money back, or try and whatever. That's what's happening. Is that, and it is an extreme instability. You've even got banks collapsing now in China. I mean, that whole business is on an extremely, particularly the property sector, on an extremely shaky basis now in China. It's by no means a given that it will survive. And as I say, it's got vast debts to world capital, not just in China. I think that the interesting, there's a couple of interesting points of it. I think in terms of what Dominic was saying, the point being, of course, is that none of the deformed worker states, not Eastern Europe, not Vietnam, not China, none of these things were created by a workers' revolution. None of them. We can understand the nature of the society and how it was put together by the Stalinists, but none of them involved a revolution. Even if you look at what happened in Eastern Europe after the Red Army walked in, defeated the Nazis, they actually reinstated capitalism. In Yugoslavia, they actually imported capitalist politicians because they'd actually all fled, so they could reinstate capitalism. And then only in 1947-48 did they then move to instating this deformed worker state. That's the point. Exactly the point. We're not going to concede, the nation of the workers taking over the factories. No way in hell. No way were they going to do that. Which was possible. And much of Eastern Europe, the workers actually did take over the factories, and they were suppressed. And understand the nature of that process. But it's not capitalism. It's not so. It's not anything we would recognise as worker state or move to socialism. But it's certainly not capitalism either. I think the point, the other point, in terms of China, I think is also to say, well, okay, yes, there has been huge amounts of foreign investment, and actually iPhone is made by a Taiwanese company, Foxconn, but there is also, the creation of this vast layer of a very, very rich Chinese. It's not a question that the capital is entirely for it is very substantially Chinese as well. I think the other thing is in terms of imperialism is the fact that Chinese are actually investing in terms of building things, which the general, the likes of the US, Britain, and so forth, not. They just don't bother. And basically, it's almost entirely, finance capitalism is almost entirely parasitic in these parts now. It just doesn't build anything. It's not interested. All of the money. So if you want something built in Africa, you don't go to the US or the British or the Germans, or whatever. You get the Chinese and say, "Can you build me this railway?" On whatever terms, because nobody else would do it. And so it's the nature of where we're sitting. But I think this is we need to develop this discussion further. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Matthew. Can we go back to you now, Ed, for some closing comments?
Okay, hang on, can you hear me? Yeah, I think you can hear me, is that right? Yeah, good, okay. Well, the initial sort of title of this discussion was that it was on the relationships and between China and the USA and the prospect of war. And it's quite interesting that most of the comrades involved, certainly in the latter part of this discussion, have been far more engaged in attempting to understand what's going on in China and the sort of response of the population to the regime and what are the relationships are like between the population and the regime. China is a new formation. The China that we know today is a new formation. I mean, the textbooks of Lenin and Trotsky and you know, even Trotsky's writings, his later writings and so on, Ted Grant's writings, none of those will actually give us all the answers to what China is today, because it's a new formation. There's a high degree of state control with a regime that's based on a tradition and a history of Stalinist type control, and the systematic controlled introduction of capitalist relations within that regime. What we have to remember in China as well is that unlike the Soviet Union, which was created by a workers' revolution, and then the Stalinist system had to fight back against the democracy that the workers had established in 1917. It had to fight back against it and gradually assert its control. In 1949 in China, there was no involvement of the working class whatsoever. But the fact that the peasant army of Mao Zedong could take power and could, within the space of a few years, nationalize all significant sections of the economy, was because of the existence globally of the Soviet Union as a model. It was you know, a precedent and a form of economy had been created that the Chinese regime was able to kind of step into the shoes of that kind of approach to running society. The Chinese regime today, well, not just today, probably for the last 20 or 30 years, has been in a process of direct clashes with the working class. There have been numerous reports in the press. If you look at the press, if you watch the press carefully, it's not often major headlines, numerous reports, especially over COVID, you know, in local areas, huge numbers of protests against the lock-ins around COVID being too stringent, people not being able to get out of their houses, people not being able to get food deliveries not being adequate, you know, the frustration of people not being able to go to work, to their normal workplaces and so on, the breakdown of relationships in cities and so on, because people were not allowed to meet as they had been before. So there is a continual conflict and clash between the regime and the working class, and at times in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been more than localized. I mean, in most cases, local authorities have been able to regain a grip and re-establish bureaucratic control, but at times it's looked as if it were coming near to a sort of national movement against the bureaucracy. So, you know, this is not a regime that sits easily in power. It's a struggle to retain power on the part of highly bureaucratic regime against a population who thirst for some change, that may not be a fully articulated program of what kind of change people want, but it certainly includes more democracy and less rule by corrupt and privileged bureaucrats. I think really, Pam, I hope I haven't missed out any important points that comrades have mentioned, any questions or so on. But I mean, I know that there's issues that have touched on sort of other developments in China, the Belt and Road Initiative, which the Chinese bureaucrats certainly hoped would open up a trade route for them into Europe, and would open up economic developments in Pakistan and Sri Lanka that they could gain benefits from. And these are initiatives that were seen by the bureaucracy as their lifeline to sort of continue to justify their own position. But with local protests and the risk of generalized protests, the Chinese bureaucracy are reassessing really their attitude to the Belt and Road Initiative, and we'll have to watch this space to see what happens. I mean, this is a country that embodies billions of people, and it's a country where the future of the world, it's a country where the working class has grown probably faster and more with mass migration from to the eastern seaboard from the rural areas of the West, where it's in the same way that Lenin describes how the Russian Revolution was created by an influx into big industrial areas of raw rural workers who were completely overwhelmed by this sort of new process of production and so on, and became militant because of the super exploitation that they were being subjected to on a 100 times greater scale. So the migrations in China of the last 30 years have built a colossal working class. It is the force for democracy in China and the force for democracy on the planet. And we haven't really begun to see the full power of that working class yet, but we can be confident that in the years to come, the Chinese working class, in the same way as the workers of Eastern Europe demonstrated that they were not going to stand up for Stalinism any longer in the late 1980s in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Russia, and so on. The same in China, that there is a brand new working class ready to assert itself, and the bureaucracy sits extremely uneasily in its position, and the future of humanity can be decided by the great events that portend in China with its mass working class. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks, Ed, for a really excellent lead off and summing up. I think it's been a great discussion. Thanks to everybody who made contributions. I think it's been most worthwhile. So that's the end of the discussion. So we'll just go, as usual, go over to Roger and see if he's got anything to say about next week's meeting.
Yes, thanks, comrades. I agree. Very good discussion in the best tradition of Win, I hope. Next week we're focusing on another aspect of the crisis. One of the most overwhelming development of the recent period has been the mass migration. The fact that millions of people have been driven from their homelands, driven by wars, by conflicts, by super exploitation, by climate catastrophe, by every kind of disaster imaginable, and their attempt to seek sanctuary in Europe has actually given an impetus to the development of really ugly, sinister, racist forces, and that's something that we haven't perhaps given enough attention to. We have a comrade who, for nearly 10 years now, he's been based in Sicily. He went there. He's not a kind of he's not working for a charity or a government agency or an NGO or anything like that. He went in order to practice solidarity with the migrants arriving in Sicily and subjected to the most horrific repression on their arrival. And he's agreed to speak to us next week about his perspective on the migration crisis, both from the point of view of the migrants and from the point of view of what the crisis has done to politics in Europe. So that's for next week. I hope to see everybody there.
Okay, thanks very much, Roger. Hope everybody will be able to make it next week. Otherwise, that's the end of the meeting. I'd like to thank you all for your attendance and declare the meeting closed. And also say good morning, afternoon or night, depending which parts of the world you're in. I think we're at all of them. Bye for now.